Good morning, everybody. What a pleasure to have you here, and what a delight it is for me to join Vuk Jeremic in co-hosting this gathering. You can tell by the attendance that this is a topic of a lot of interest and curiosity, as it is around the world. It's also not a simple topic. I will give you a quiz question right now. So if you really want to be an insider in this topic, you have to be able to identify the following initials: GHG, GCF, MOI, INDC, GEF, IPCC, COP21, UNFCCC. If you score it all, you pass and you should become a climate negotiator. If, like the rest of humanity, you say, "What is that?" This is part of the challenge of taking a very intricate set of negotiations and helping to make them reach the world public whose future depends on them in an effective manner. All of those initials, those acronyms, refer to parts of a complicated global negotiating process that involves a very complicated set of challenges, yet that boil down to some very difficult and stark problems for the whole planet. I want to start back at the basics just for a couple of minutes, and then proceed back to all of those initials and acronyms and negotiations and try to explain the stakes for Serbia and the stakes for the Balkans region and for the whole world. So the basics are just a bad accident. And the bad accident is that the way we use energy in the world, while very important for our economic well-being, turns out to be very dangerous for the planet and the climate when carried out at large scale. The problem is that when we burn coal, oil, and natural gas, which runs the world economy, the carbon in those carbon fuels combusts with oxygen. That's what creates the energy. Carbon dioxide is released into the air. And carbon dioxide is what's called a greenhouse gas. It means that it allows the sunshine to reach the Earth, the ultraviolet radiation to reach the planet, to warm the Earth. But when the Earth, in response to the warming, radiates heat back out to space in the form of infrared radiation, that radiation is trapped by the carbon dioxide. It doesn't simply go back to space. That makes the planet warmer. By the way, that's what allows life on Earth. But if there's too much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, the planet warms beyond its natural equilibrium, and that's what's happening now because of how much coal, oil, and gas the world as a whole is using. There are several greenhouse gases that are being pumped into the atmosphere by our human actions. Carbon dioxide is the main one. The second most important is methane, which is a byproduct of agriculture and of our waste dumps and of other industrial processes. That's CH4. And the third is nitrous oxide, which also is a byproduct of agriculture and industrial processes. And then there are a number of very particular industrial chemicals that have fluorine in them that also have this greenhouse effect. Now, the idea that these greenhouse gases warm the planet is not a new idea. It actually was first propounded by a French scientist in 1824, 190 years ago. Joseph Fourier said our atmosphere keeps the planet warm through this kind of effect. That was even before the chemistry was understood. And then in the 19th century, the chemistry was worked out, and then a great genius named Svante Arrhenius, a Nobel laureate in Sweden, during an 18-month period without a computer, of course, without any models, was able to work out by paper and pencil the effect of doubling the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere on the temperature of Earth. And he calculated correctly that this would be somewhere between 2 degrees Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius. It was an act of great genius that he could figure that out, because it took a century of computer models and great advances in Earth science to confirm his findings from 1896. But Dr. Arrhenius made one assumption that turned out not to be correct. He said back in 1896 that because humanity was burning so much coal, that the doubling of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would take about 750 years. It turns out that because of the growth of the world economy and the rise of China, in particular recently, the acceleration of coal and oil and gasoline use has been so dramatic that what Dr. Arrhenius thought would take 750 years is going to be compressed into 150 years. And for us, we're 120 years into that process, so there's just 30 years left, basically. We've reached the end of the safe period, or even the relatively safe period, of how much greenhouse gas, mainly carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide, can be put into the atmosphere. Now, there are still a few people around the world that say this is not right. But actually, the scientific community is in as much consensus about these facts that I've just stated as about any scientific facts. In other words, the theory is very well established, very detailed. There is a campaign by some members of the oil industry to try to discredit this worldwide. And so there's a lot of propaganda. We have a newspaper called the Wall Street Journal in the United States. It's the biggest newspaper in the world. It's actually a great newspaper, except on the fantasy pages called the editorial page, which is science fiction or anti-science pages, because it's run by Mr. Rupert Murdoch, who is one of the most cynical people in the world, and his friends from the oil sector. But there's really no doubt, actually, about these facts and about how serious they are, and about how our time is running out to do something. When the scientists have looked at this issue from many different points of view, they've reached a basic conclusion, which is that we should keep the warming on average on the planet to below 2 degrees Celsius. And that level was agreed by the world's governments in 2009 and then formalized in another agreement in 2010. So there's already a world standard. Keep warming less than 2 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? Less than 2 degrees compared to what? Compared to the temperatures that prevailed before the industrial era began 2 centuries ago. Now, we've already increased the temperature through this greenhouse effect by 0.85 of 1 degree Celsius. So we're almost halfway to the 2-degree limit. And given what we've done so far in raising the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the Earth is still catching up to that warming because it takes a long time to heat the bathtub we call the oceans. They don't warm instantly. They absorb a huge amount of heat before they warm. In fact, the oceans absorb about 90% of the net heat imbalance of the planet, the land only 10%. So the oceans are warming gradually, and if we just had the existing level of greenhouse gases from now forever, the planet would probably warm to about 1.4 or 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. In other words, we're almost at the end of the margin of the 2 degrees C. How can we stay below the 2 degrees C? Well, for that you need climate science to say how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases can be put into the air and still stay most likely below the 2-degree limit. And the answer is a little bit grim for us, ladies and gentlemen, because the answer is that if we want to keep below the 2-degree limit, there's only about 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide left that we could put into the air. But every year now, the world is emitting 36 billion tons by all of the coal, oil, and gas that is being burned. So if you just do the arithmetic, 1,000 divided by 36, we have less than 30 years left before we reach a threshold that will put us above the 2 degrees C, very likely. That's not good. It's even worse than that simple calculation for 2 reasons. First, the world economy is growing, and therefore the emissions of carbon dioxide are also growing, so we're not even constant at the 36 billion level. In other words, we have even less time than simply making that division. The second problem is that the other greenhouse gases are also increasing, so the amount available for carbon dioxide is therefore reduced from roughly 1,000 billion tons remaining to about 875 million tons. So divide 875 by 36 and you get an even smaller number. In other words, time is running out. Some people say, who cares? The reason we care is that the amount of damage we can do to the planet is frightening, it's unknowable, but it's potentially catastrophic. There are 2 big problems with 2 degrees C. One is that we'll have a lot more disruptions like the floods you had last May, or like the 2 meters of snow that are falling yesterday and today in Buffalo, 2 meters in 2 days, because the atmosphere now carries so much more water in a warmer environment. So you have these catastrophic events, whether it's rains or massive snows or the massive floods that you experienced, or the droughts, the heat waves, and so forth. That's one set of problems. The other problem is that the scientists tell us that the Earth is like an unstable balance, that if we push it too hard, it can spin even further out of control, what are called tipping points. And the scientists are begging the policy makers and the rest of us, stay below 2 degrees. We can't predict afterwards that we don't have an onward spiral, a tipping point that puts us out of control. You'd think we'd kind of care about this, but we barely have acted. This comes to the next problem, which is what to do. Well, the world did get together 22 years ago to sign one of those initials, UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the law of the land. Serbia is a signatory, the United States is a signatory, all the world's countries have signed an agreement to stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in order to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. That's the phrase. Anthropogenic means caused by humanity. So stabilize the greenhouse gases to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference. 22 years later, we haven't done it yet because there's huge momentum or inertia in the world's energy system. Coal, oil, and gas are great energy sources if it were not for the fact that they are wrecking the planet. In other words, nothing's wrong with them. We wouldn't even have a modern world without coal, oil, and gas. But this side effect is really a big problem now. So even though we don't want to do something about it, we have to do something about it, but it's quite hard because it's saying let's change the guts of the world economy. You know, a small sector can change here and there, but when you talk about energy, you're talking about the very heart of the world economy, the thing that makes all the rest of the sectors work. And we have to move beyond the fossil fuels, and shockingly, we have to do it within 2 generations. And we had 3 generations to do it, but we gave up 1 because we spent the last 22 years talking about all those initials, but not actually doing anything. So we're really running out of time to do something. What needs to be done? 1,000 things, but I'll try to describe just 3 things. 3 things to move us from a fossil fuel-based world economy to a low-carbon world economy. Number 1, much more energy efficiency. We have to get more output per unit energy. We can do that. There's some simple ways, for example, making sure that buildings are better insulated and better designed so that when the heat is pumped in, it doesn't just go out of the building. And there's a huge amount of gain that can be made just from energy saving. Second is we have to produce electricity in a low carbon manner. This is key. Right now, Serbia gets its electricity mainly by burning lignite or coal. But the whole world needs to move to solar power, wind power, nuclear power, what's called carbon capture and sequestration, which means burn the coal but then prevent the carbon dioxide from going into the air, hydropower, or a few other technologies that also can play a role, but probably at a smaller scale, like geothermal power. So the second pillar is what's called decarbonizing electricity. The third pillar is electrifying the transport sector and the building sector. When we drive our cars, we have internal combustion engines. Within 20 years, those are going to have to be electric vehicles instead, charged by low-carbon electricity or equivalent technologies like fuel cells. And when you warm your buildings here in Belgrade, you have a furnace or a boiler, and in the future, that's going to have to be electricity turning a heat pump. So it's going to have to be electrification rather than boilers and furnaces in buildings. These are the basic 3 pillars for any economy. And every part of the world has to scratch its head and said, what do we do? What is our potential? How much hydropower do we have? How much sunshine do we have? How much wind power do we have? What should we do? Should we try coal, carbon capture and sequestration, and so on. Every country needs a strategy for deep decarbonization, we call it. In other words, a transition out of the carbon economy. Now, that's the basic idea, but we need something more. We need a global agreement, because no individual country is going to do this on its own. If all the rest of the world continues in the old way, it doesn't matter what any individual country does. And so we need a shared global deep decarbonization. And we need the world's governments to agree on that. And so far they haven't, both because they haven't had a good technology strategy and because cooperation has proved to be elusive. My own country, the United States, has been one of the biggest obstacles to this, because the US was for a long time the biggest emitter in the world, and it said, we're not doing it unless China also does the same. And China said, why should we do the same? You caused all the problems for so long. And so the two sides basically pointed fingers at each other, did very little, and the rest of the world said, what is this? The two biggest emitters just arguing with each other, why should we do anything? And then it's generally the fact that if you are a country that has a lot of coal, oil, or gas, you say, well, that's all fine, but let others do it. We want to continue to make our living the way we do. So within the European Union, Poland says, don't go so fast, we're coal. And Serbia is a coal-based economy. It would also say, yeah, do it, but leave us alone. And Canada is just a petro state because it has so much oil in Alberta. They send the prime minister, and that's the oil industry. And in Australia, which hosted the G20 last week, the prime minister was elected by the mining sector. So he said, I don't even want to talk about climate change. And the other members of the G20 said, are you kidding? How can you not talk about it? But it was obvious that he was elected by the mining sector. They paid the money. So he didn't want to talk about it. So he brazened it out. He said, I'm not going to talk about it. Fortunately, all the rest of the G20 did talk about it. So you see, it's interest groups, it's the status quo, it's the complications of technology change, it's every country saying, after you, thank you. And in the meantime, we just continue going right over the cliff. Now, from 1992, in 1997, as Kuni from Japan said, he started at the Kyoto negotiations, what was COP3. An agreement was reached. The US signed it but never ratified it, and it didn't make much difference, and China wasn't part of it. Then in 2009 was the next great attempt to move beyond Kyoto. That was in Copenhagen. And some of you will recall the dramatic picture of the world leaders leaning over each other in the last moment of negotiations, which is no way to run the world, by the way. And the meeting broke up without an agreement, really. And then, the Kyoto Protocol didn't work and it expired, and the Copenhagen Agreement didn't work, and so the world leaders said, we better do something. So they said in 2010, let's reach an agreement no later than 2015. And by the way, no later than 2015, so it can be ratified by 2018 to go into effect in 2020. So that's the kind of urgency we have. Oh my God. This is our last chance, really, next year. Because if we don't reach an agreement that's effective next year, we're really lost. I don't think anyone's going to come back to COP22. That just means Conference of the Parties, the 21st meeting. The first was in Berlin in 1995, the third in Kyoto in 1997, and the 21st will be in Paris next December, and the 20th in Lima next month. if we don't work it out by COP21, forget it. Not only do we not have even the time left to stay below 2 degrees C, I don't think the political reality will say, well, we failed again and again and again, let's try again. We'll go a long time in a kind of disaster, I fear. So all the eyes are focused on next year, making sure that we reach a serious agreement. So how about a little good news? The little bit of good news is that last week, the G2, China and the United States, announced, okay, we agree to take this seriously. And they put forward some plans that had the rest of the world saying, oh, that's good. The two biggest emitters are talking, cooperating, and aiming for a real agreement. This is a big deal. It's a historic event, actually, last week's announcement by China and the United States. Now, Europe, as Vuk mentioned a few minutes ago, has already moved to a bold initiative. By the way, Europe has moved because Europe's very vulnerable to climate change, and it's not a major fossil fuel producing region, so it's not trapped in politics the same way as the US or Canada or Australia is. So it's a good, strong combination of vulnerable like all of us, but also not trapped by domestic fossil fuel producers. And so Europe's been bold in saying we've got to move. So now we have the US, the European Union, and China all on side. And I can tell you also from the G20 discussions last week that India, with Prime Minister Modi, India's new Prime Minister, made very positive references. It's very hard for India. It's a coal-based economy and quite poor. But Prime Minister Modi said that India really is determined to move to renewable energy. They have a lot of sunshine. They have a lot of alternative energy potential. And so that's very, very promising. What am I hoping for from COP21? An agreement next year that does the following, that says we reinforce our commitment to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. We announce each of us what we'll do up to the year 2025 or 2030. We all commit to put forward for the world's inspection deep decarbonization plans all the way to the year 2050 to show the world we're committed to going all the way to a low and effectively a zero carbon economy in the second half of this century, to move out of fossil fuels entirely, except with the little bit that can be allowed with the carbon capture and sequestration technology. And finally, we commit to a major effort on research and development and demonstration and diffusion, that is spread, of low carbon technologies. And when Cooney mentioned the technology cooperation under the agreement, I want to try to add $100 billion at least of real R&D commitments to support that, because agreeing on technology is one thing, but investing in it is what's really needed. We need huge breakthroughs in certain technologies, storing solar energy at low cost, capturing and storing carbon dioxide, better batteries for electric vehicles, and so forth, or effective fuel cell technology like Toyota is pioneering. We need to make big breakthroughs in a very short period of time. So I envision that kind of four-part agreement. We commit to the 2 degrees Celsius, short-term commitments up to the year 2025 or 2030, like China and the US announced last week, much deeper commitments, not necessarily legally binding, but showing how to make the path to a zero carbon economy, and then major investments in research and development. That's what we should be doing next year. Finally, what does it mean for this country, for Serbia? What does it mean for this region? It's not great news. There's no simple, great answer, because Serbia is a coal-based economy, for example, and coal will not have an effective place in the world energy system in 20 or 30 years, unless it's accompanied by massive carbon capture and sequestration. Otherwise, coal will simply be phased out entirely. And so the questions for this region are, first, to understand the dangers. Now, the dangers are very high, unfortunately, for the Balkans region and for the Mediterranean basin in general. The whole Mediterranean is drying. The climate science is very clear on this. The whole civilization of the Mediterranean is a threat because all of the dynamics of the Earth's climate lead to more warming and drying of this region. That's one. Second, more extreme events. Serbia itself has had more droughts, more heat waves, and more floods than in its past. So all three of those are consistent with the climate impacts. So there's a lot of danger. That's the one side. You have to take it seriously because, like every other part of the world, we're all going to be hit very hard. There's no avoiding it. Second, Serbia, like the rest of the world, is going to need to overhaul the energy system. Now, fortunately, Serbia has renewable energy capacity, untapped, new hydro capacity, wind, solar, and other possibilities. But they need to be systematically analyzed, measured, assessed, and developed. There is new industry to be built here, but it's hard work. And it won't just be Serbia alone or even this region alone. It has to be part of a broader grid that connects with Western Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. So this is hard work that hasn't been done yet. And one thing I strongly recommend is that every country undertake such a detailed analysis. And our unit of the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, together, VUC is one of the leaders of this effort, on behalf of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, we are committed to assisting any government that wants to undertake a deep decarbonization analysis. I believe it's really important to do so, if nothing more right now than to understand the negotiating realities that Serbia is going to face and the kind of world realities that Serbia or all of the neighboring countries are going to face. You need this analysis to understand the real situation. In fact, I've often complained that without this kind of analysis of what to do, all these negotiations are a little bit like a poker game in which everyone's sitting with cards that has nothing on the cards. There are just blank cards, because nobody really knows what their national interests are because they haven't been analyzed very closely. And for that, we need deep engineering and a deep look at the real alternatives that are available. And we're committed to helping you to do that for any governments that are interested. This issue will not go away. In fact, it will become central to national, regional, and global politics, inevitably, one way or another, in the coming years. We're now entering a very intense period of negotiation. Also, since the European Union is a leader in this and Serbia is aspiring to membership in the European Union, which has commitments to deep decarbonization. This adds another dimension for the national effort. Thank you for being here. I think the filled room shows the very high interest. Don't just stay tuned, but become participants. And I know with CIRSD and with the SDSN and all the other initials that you have been part of today, together we can make tremendous progress. Thank you very much.